The person I'm talking about tonight is the German philosopher, critic, cultural theorist, whatever you want to call him, Walter Benjamin, or Walter Benjamin. And I'm going to talk about specifically a text by him, which is a very early text. He wrote in 1917, well before his more famous The Work of Art in the Age of Its Mechanical Reproducibility text. Benjamin is well known for that particular text, but this is an earlier one. If you're interested, it's available in English in the first volume of the Selected Writings. But before I start, let me just say that one of the questions that this lecture pivots around is a very old-fashioned problem, and that is the discrepancy between object and language. Namely, the moment I write about something, I write about it in language, but the thing does not exist in language. It exists as architecture or sculpture or whatever it is. It doesn't exist in language. One of the great problems of literary criticism, and this was very much the case in the 19th century, was what was described as the problem of prose. And the problem with prose was, if I write about a poem which is in poetry, which is a type of language, writing about it necessitates that I use prose. Does that not in some sense damage the object? Or is there another way of thinking about that relation? Now, one of the things I'm going to talk about tonight is very much linked to the question of painting, but it does have a relationship to architecture. And I just want to outline that very simply. That one of the very early texts that Walter Benjamin writes, a text rarely studied, but I think of central importance, was his first doctoral thesis on the concept of criticism. And one of the things that comes out of that, or at least one of the things I would take from that, rather than him necessarily saying it, and it does emerge here, is that something only is what it is through the act of criticism. In other words, a work of art is only a work of art because it's describable and discussable as a work of art. Now, if that sounds odd, think about the relationship between architecture and sculpture. Think about the relationship, for example, between Caro's work, which is on at the Tate, which you must go and see, and the question of what architecture is. Caro is very interesting that he actually gives some of his sculptures architectural names. Now, the reason why, as it were, he's wrong to do that is that whatever you could say about architecture, you couldn't say about sculpture, because architecture is not sculpture and sculpture is not architecture. One can talk about the relationship between them. I'll give you a very clear example. Diller and Scafidio's Blur building, this is the fog building they did in Switzerland, is not architecture, it's conceptual art. Nothing wrong with it being conceptual art, but it's not architecture. Therefore, the architectural question is what within the Blur building is interesting for architecture. And that's the question to ask. What is it about sculpture that is interesting for architecture? Turn it round. What is it about architecture that could be interesting for sculpture? Which is not to say that they're the same. Now, in making that point, what I'm also making is that in talking about them and in addressing their particularity, I establish it as architecture. In other words, I don't blur the boundaries. I insist that the Blur building is conceptual art. And only by insisting that it's conceptual art does it become possible for it to enter into a relationship with architecture. Why? Because the description, this is conceptual art, the words, this is conceptual art, establishes conceptual art. In other words, there's something about the power of language that gives something its identity. Now, however, it can't just be any description. It's got to be a description that addresses one particular question. How is the Blur building conceptual art? That it is, let's not worry. How is it conceptual art? And in describing that, what I'm doing is describing the way in which it exists as conceptual art. If I'm interested in architectural criticism, I'm not interested in, God forbid, sociology or aesthetics or anything like this. What I'm interested in is how something exists as architecture. And we can debate the way it exists as architecture, but the project of criticism, this will come up central in the Benjamin text, the problem of criticism is to address the specificity of this specific instance. Like, this is an instance of architecture. How is this instance an instance of architecture? It's got to be able to be named as such. And what language then, instead of transgressing the poem by calling it prose, or transgressing the painting by moving it into words, or transgressing something by letting it live in another medium, it's by letting it live in the medium of language that it can that's the only way in which it can exist. It doesn't exist prior to being named. Now there's one other guy who believed this. Things don't exist prior to them being named, and he's not here amongst us, though he could be, and that's God. Because if you go back to Genesis, which you probably go back to not that often, what God did was name and create, blah, 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 and then he created and named the beasts. In other words, the power of language, the power of the name, creates something. So there's a great history then of this relationship between being and naming. And if you had a chance to look at the Benjamin text, you'll see that this is central to the overall argument. But the secular and important version of it is that criticism is that which establishes the work of art as art. It's not art prior to that. It's simply an object. But what the critic does is he or she names it as art. And then the responsibility of the critic is to say how it is. Not that it is, that's the sociologist, the most uninteresting species. That it is, how it is rather, is what the job of art criticism or architectural criticism is, but as you'll see, it will always shift from one medium to the next. Now, Benjamin, in his very first doctoral thesis, the German academic system is sort of wonderful. It insists you do 2 doctoral theses. Benjamin's first was on the concept of German criticism, and this, I believe, is the implicit argument that the true work is criticizable because you release within it its capacity to become prose. And you'll see this is fundamental. So the question of prose, which is a word we use rarely, but it's such a wonderful word, the question of prose is the question of the possibility of naming an object. When you write about a building, you're inserting it into prose. Therefore, you're releasing its prosaic kernel. You allow it to emerge as criticizable. Therefore, you give it the identity of art or architecture or whatever it is. And this is a fundamentally important argument if one's thinking about what it means to write about architecture or to write about art. Not when you reduce architecture or art to examples of something. So it's an example of, so it doesn't really matter what it is, it's just an example of something. But you're addressing its specificity, its particularity. You're responding to it respectfully, in other words. If I treated any one of you, as in terms of your individuality, as anyone else, then this would be disrespectful. I'd just say, well, you're just like anyone else. Why should I bother treating you differently? You're just part of the mass. I'd just reduce you to being an instance of this general thing. That's not respectful. The only way you treat an art object or an architectural object respectfully is by addressing their particularity. And in addressing their particularity, it comes to be as art or architecture. So therefore there's a lot to say about this whole question of the relationship between prose and criticism. As you'll see, this builds into the sort of things I've been talking about earlier this week. So this is a text by Benjamin very early in his career. And he wrote around this time a great many little texts about colour, about the line, about painting, all of which are gathered together in, some of which are translated into English in Volume 1, but if you're lucky enough to read German, they're all gathered together in Volume 2 of the complete works. There's a whole lot of little texts. So, initial access to Benjamin's early writings on painting is provided by a letter he wrote to his friend Gershom Scholem on the 22nd of October 1917. Scholem had written to Benjamin outlining his own theory of art. Indeed, it was a theory of cubism, and Benjamin was so irritated by it that he wrote this text back to Scholem as part of a letter. Benjamin is responding to, in this little text I'm going to comment on, to a philosophy of painting sketched by Scholem, and which would generate an account of all specific types of painting. Scholem's formal analysis uses notion of line, colour, and their subsequent combination. However, for Benjamin, this is insufficient. You can't simply generate an account of an object by looking at the elements of its assemblage, the things that it's made up of. The reason why this is the case is not just true for formal reasons, but because it misunderstands the relationship between the internal world of an art object and the external world. And if you remember the sort of things I was trying to say yesterday about the question of representation, representation is always a relationship between an external world and an internal world. What Benjamin will get to at the end of this rather difficult little paper is to think about how internality operates, and it operates as a system. The latter is described by Benjamin in the letter as the painting's sensuous object. Benjamin's response is to suggest that what is needed is not to give a description of painting in relation to its being as an assemblage, but to think through what happens when painting is brought into the realm of language. I paraphrase him. And when it's brought into the realm of language, it's when a painting emerges as prose. But the temptation is to think that that would be a description. It was neutral, just a description. It's not. To bring painting, for Benjamin, to bring painting into its relationship to language is to allow the painting to be as a painting, by allowing it to be named. Only then, he would argue, would it be possible to deal with particularity. The reference in the letter to language, and thus to the primacy of the word, is intended, as Benjamin makes clear, to invoke his early work, Benjamin's early work on language. However, it also opens another path, and that is, as I've indicated in my introductory remarks, his dissertation on romantic criticism, and thus to another conception of word. We need to rethink the concept of the word and of language in terms of prose. In other words, we have to think of the relationship between Sprache and prosa, and prose becomes the key term in which to think about the operation of artworks. This is Benjamin writing in 1917. Prior to pursuing these possible openings, it is essential to stay with the letter. On one level, it would seem that Scholem's evocation of painting's constitutive elements would open up the possibility of rethinking the whole of generic determinations in favour of the object. And again, let me try and locate this question of the object historically just for a moment. In the history of philosophy, there is this thing that we talk about called aesthetics. And the word, which is a word we use all the time, the word aesthetics comes from a Greek word meaning experience. And the great theorist of aesthetics is the 18th century German philosopher Immanuel Kant. And what he was interested in was the conditions of possibility for the experience of an object. And so aesthetics is the relationship between an experiencing subject and an object. Now, in the history of philosophy, aesthetics, as it were, begins and ends with Kant. The reason why it begins and ends with Kant is that Kant did not and could not have a theory of the object. It's only with Hegel, and on the one hand, and with German Romanticism on the other, that we begin to have a philosophical intimation of what a philosophy of the object would be like, the specific art object. Now, what Benjamin is doing in building on Romanticism is trying to, but not Hegel, but Romanticism, is trying to identify what it is to think an object. Now, it's the art object in this instance. Now, the difficulty that Benjamin has with Scholem's idea is that it gives you an immediate relationship between internality and externality. This immediate relationship can have two forms, both of which he disagrees with. One is that the work of art is a representation of that which is external to it, immediate. Secondly, that the immediate response to it is either what I feel about it or the description of it, as though it was simply there to be described. In other words, that art criticism and criticism in general necessitates, and I have to say for what it's worth, I agree with this, necessitates immediacy. It necessitates that moment in which simple description or external internal relationships are distanced. I mentioned this in my first lecture. If I didn't, I ought to have. It's a letter that Flaubert writes that I'm obsessed by, so I'll just share this with you. I did mention it, but I'll mention it again because it's such a nice story. Flaubert writes to his mistress, Louise Collet, about her desire to write this particular novel, prose work, a very old prose work. And he says, and she said, look, I really ought to go and have a look at things, the role of servants and servant women in order to write about them. He said, of course you should. But then he says, do not write immediately what is under the eye. You need to take time. Why? Because he says that things have an esprit, a spirit, that if you lapsed into description, you'd reduce things to mere empirical presence. Of course, what is real about objects is their animate quality, their esprit. And so he wants to introduce into the activity of writing the necessity of immediacy. Now this is 1857, this is 50 years before this. But nonetheless, both in Flaubert and elsewhere, we get this recognition that what makes writing and criticism possible, indeed what makes thinking possible in general, is the refusal of immediacy and the opening of a space which is, as it were, filled slowly, that's not rushed into. Now Benjamin also wants to distance the notion of immediacy, wants to put to one side both an inside-outside opposition in relation to the art object, but equally distance the notion of description, as that's all it is. And he thinks that Scholem is not, the way Scholem's work operates is not going to take him in that direction. If there is a necessity for immediacy, then it does not lie simply in the possibility of the immediate. On the contrary, it lies in the way the object exists. In other words, it's a claim about the specificity of the object. In other words, though to employ a language that is not Walter Benjamin's, it lies in the relationship between the ontology of the art object, in this instance painting, and its becoming an object of experience. That while you may experience the traffic light immediately, because if you didn't there would be problems, whether or not the object of art or the object of criticism is experienced immediately is the question. And the question then, if that's the case, then we need a more complex theory of experience than what then would come from Kant, the German philosopher, 18th century philosopher Kant. And it's very intriguing that if you read Benjamin's early texts, he's continually wrestling with both Kantian epistemology and the notion of experience that comes from Kant. Kant cannot give one a question of experience that is linked to the possibility of the mediate, where mediate is the temporal, where the move into prose, as it were, takes time. So throughout Benjamin's writing, as I said, there is a continual attempt to distance himself both from a Kantian epistemology, Kantian theory of knowledge, but equally from a Kantian sense of experience. Moving from a Kantian to a Benjaminian sense of possibility is not just to introduce a historical sense of experience, but to also recognize that art objects and experience in general is inextricably bound up with conflict. The link between possibility and conflict is identified in Benjamin's writings by such terms as class struggle or the history of barbarism, etc., in his famous comment that there is no one element of culture that is not in some sense tinged with the history of barbarism. The question raised by the interrelation of possibility and conflict is the extent to which it has a determining effect on the critique of immediacy. Now, there's a lot more I can say about immediacy, but I won't immediately. I will come back to it, because I think what we need to see is the way in which the object emerges as that which demands mediacy. And mediacy, I mean, it's a dreadful word, I know, but mediacy simply means taking your time. The English word immediate means two things, but they're related. One, it means not mediated, but it means now. Do it immediately. Like now. Don't wait, do it now. So the word immediate in English brings a temporal dimension of now, but equally it means, in the philosophical sense, not mediated by. So if something's mediated by, it's not simply that it's not immediate, it takes time. So we need to come back to the question of immediacy. Now the paper of Benjamin's I'm going to look at, in English is called On Paintings or Signs and Marks, M-A-R-K-S. Now in French, in German indeed, it's called, excuse my pronunciation, Über die Malerei oder Zeichen und Mal. Now Mal is the German word for Mach, and Malerei is the word for painting, but in one you hear the other. So the English we don't hear Mark in painting, but for the German ear, bless it, you hear these two things resounding together. So while remaining unpublished in his lifetime, this short text provides an important focus for any treatment of Benjamin's overall concern with art, and therefore with the specificity of objects, which will include in the end, as I'll try and indicate, architectural objects. Now, painting obviously emerges as a topic in the famous essay, painting along with architecture obviously emerges as a topic in the famous essay, The Work of Art in the Age of Its Mechanical Reproducibility. In addition, there is a review of an exhibition of Chinese painting that was held in the Bibliothèque Nationale during Benjamin's period in Paris, which he also wrote a review of, which he wrote in French. It's a very intriguing paper that's his actual jobbing art criticism, for which he got, paid 8 and 6 and could eat that night. While Benjamin's ostensible concerns were with the effects of photography, references to painting and throughout his writings have a sustained presence. The implicit question always concerns the status of painting. Now, the reason why we're interested in that, we could be interested in painting, and why not? The reason why we're interested in that is that we're interested in the nature of particularity. We're interested in how you think the architectural, as opposed to painting, as opposed to sculptural, as opposed to video, etc., etc., where each of these things are related, but it's only by allowing for particularity to be named as particulars that we can think relationality. So let me move to the text. And it's a very short text, it's 2 pages long, but I've written, 20 pages on it, so it's one of those texts where you don't understand it even after you've written 20 pages, and then you think, why did I bother? But it's worth it. While it may yield, and I say this, while it may yield a task almost as long as the brief work itself, if not longer, is nonetheless vital that the detail of its formulations be noted. In every instance, we need to act respectfully. While emphasis will be given to painting, it emerges from a consideration of the mark. And here, as one of my colleagues in the room knows, is Kandinsky's stuff on the line and mark as well. In the 20s, both Kandinsky, both Benjamin, Klee, a whole group of people wrote texts on lines and marks. So these are not aberrant things, these are clearly topics that are in the air. And part of the reason why they're in the air has to do with moves in the history of art, equally moves in the history of architecture, but something is happening so that all of a sudden different people are starting to write about lines and marks. And it's a topic well worthy of study. The text starts by invoking what Benjamin calls the realm of signs. Within it, the line has different meanings. These differing possibilities include what Benjamin calls the written line, the graphic line, and then he describes this thing, which I'll come back to, as the line of the absolute sign. Now, if you want to know what the line of the absolute sign is, extraordinary expression, isn't it? Wander downtown, National Gallery, Rembrandt Room, Balthazar's Feast, one of the great Rembrandt paintings, extraordinary painting. And you know the story, don't you? Nebuchadnezzar's boy, Nebuchadnezzar hadn't been such a great guy, Balthazar's the son, sins of the fathers, etc., etc., and God writes, you are doomed tomorrow, the way God does. Tricky bugger. And that's the hand appears, and they all look, and the wonderful thing Rembrandt does it, one looking up there. Now, what is that? What is that? That is the damnation. What the writing is nothing other than it's what we would now call it's being a performative. It simply is the absolute sign. It doesn't stand for anything. It is that moment in which Balthazar is damned. And there's no equivocation, there's no, what does it really mean? How do I take the I will die tomorrow? You know, is this a poem? No, the guy's dead 24 hours later. So it's the performative, it's that complete enactment. Therefore, therefore we have a really interesting thing. In Rembrandt's painting, we get the notion of what a line is like. Here's a line of writing, written in Aramaic, a line of writing whose status is absolute, because it's absolutely unequivocal. It doesn't stand for anything. It doesn't represent anything. It is what it is. It's the absolute sign. And it's a splendid painting, and it's in the Rembrandt Room downtown. Just go and have a look at it, and then you can see the absolute sign. And this is described as magical. What is meant by this designation will be of fundamental importance. The line is not defined, therefore, by what it represents. And indeed, we can't bring the concepts and categories of representation to it. What does this line represent? Nothing. It is what it is. Its magical nature is not given by a relationship between the external and the internal. Benjamin says it's magical as such. Here, both the object and its projective quality, its having that quality is, of course, part of its magic, both form part of the object. It is as though the object now has a thickness. No longer the presentation of an outside. It then registers as more than a simple surface. In other words, it has this doubled existence I was trying to talk about yesterday. It's both itself and something else. It is both that writing in Aramaic that says to Balthazar, that's it, baby. It says that, but those lines are themselves and that in addition. So it's more than a simple surface. It has a sort of, the word I used to describe it, I don't know if it's the right one, was it has a thickness. This move to a definition in terms of an absolute. An absolute is given beyond any simple oscillation between an inside and an outside, will continue to be of real significance. Benjamin, in his little text, does not consider either geometric or written lines. He moves straight to a discussion of what he calls the graphic line. The importance of this form of line is how it comes to acquire its identity. Its emergence is in contrast to area, and the German word for area contains within it the word for surface. So the word for surface, excuse my accent again, is Oberfläche. The word for area is Fläche. So in the word for area, you hear the word surface. There are certain contexts when that word Fläche can be used to mean surface. But what he's interested in is the relationship between the line and the area, or the line and the surface. He says that this relationship is not simply graphic. For him, and I quote him, it's metaphysical. The graphic line marks out an area and as such becomes its background. Reciprocally, of course, a graphic line exists in relation to, but equally in its differentiation from the background. Background, therefore, has a fundamental meaning for drawing because it sustains identity. While the significance graphically of background cannot be denied, of equal importance is what Benjamin refers to as the metaphysical dimension. This has to do with the conferring, thus the securing of identity. Benjamin writes, and I quote, that the graphic line confers identity on its background. If I have a white page, this is not an area. It's not even a surface. If I draw a line on this, a graphic line, the drawing of that line constitutes this as an area, or constitutes this as a surface. In other words, it's not a surface on which I do something. The doing of it constitutes it as a surface, as an area. And if you think about it, and I'll come on to this, is that again it's a sort of more art historical claim that one of the great questions in art history is the nature of the word composition, of what allows a work to be what it is. And when I want to come to Benjamin's interpretation of Raphael, what becomes interesting is that composition becomes a series of internal relations. So the notion of composition in art already allows us to talk about how these two elements, or elements on a page, constitute each other's identity. It's more complex than that. We'll come on to it. Of greater significance, especially in relation to the rethinking of the surface, is the following comment, and I quote, "The identity of the background of a drawing is quite different from that of the white surface on which it is inscribed. We might even deny it that identity by thinking of it as a surge of white waves, though these might not be distinguishable to the naked eye, end quote. So the identity of the background of a drawing is quite different from that of the white surface. So already, if we just pause there, in order to think about the particularity of drawing, we have to recognize that the concepts and categories proper to other forms of talking are not appropriate. In other words, if we want to talk about art and drawing, then we have to talk about it in relation to that which is proper to it. Now, what's interesting is that the essentialist says, oh, then art must have an essential quality, as though there's some essence or Wesen to art, and then the Heideggerian path would open. That's not the argument at all. This is an argument as much about specificity as it is about the technological. In other words, it's the physical act of drawing the line on the white sheet that constitutes it as background and it as line. In other words, there's nothing to do with art having an essential nature that's released through the act. It's rather that art is part of that which has an operational nature, but it's different to other things. It's different to plumbing, it's different to surgery. It's neither better nor worse, it's just different. Now, but however, in this extraordinary passage, he says, we might even deny it that identity by thinking of this white surface as a surge of white waves that are not distinguishable to the naked eye. Now, to me at least, what is of real note in this formulation is that this difference, and therefore the identity, may not be evident to the eye. In other words, despite having a graphic result, it would not have simple graphic presence. Surface is therefore far more than literal surface. Within drawing, surfaces cannot be reduced to the status of a blank white space. In other words, the surface within drawing is constituted by the activity that we call drawing. You don't draw on a blank surface. You create the surface of a drawing by drawing. A way of understanding what Benjamin means by the metaphysical can be located in the distinction between simple graphic presence and what is not given to the eye. Now, again, let me pause here and say that if this constitutive moment is not given to the eye, then already you can see that this will demand, in the act of its description, the notion of mediacy. In other words, if it were immediate, I would simply describe it. It's a line on a white background, and that's it. But because it's not, this relationship is not given to the eye as such, it has to be constituted through an act of writing. So already description becomes writing. And again, without playing too much with languages, in German and French, the word description, their word as it were, contains within it the word writing. And so there's something about writing being brought into our description but being modified. The next part of the text is on what Benjamin calls the absolute sign. Its significance lies in part in what Benjamin describes as its relation to the absolute mark. It's in connection to the latter that painting emerges. Signs have a spatial relation and refer to persons. Example of the absolute sign include the sign of Cain and the one that the Israelites put on the door to ward off the angel of death during the 10th plague. These are quotations from Benjamin. The spatiality of the sign is given by a form of distance. The sign is other than what it signifies. Now that's the interesting part. If we're thinking about a theory of signification, the red mark on the door is other than what it signifies. It means something. The red mark means something. So it's other than what it signifies. So it's a relationship between a signifier and a signified. You can see what's so interesting about Benjamin is he doesn't want to think about art in terms of a theory of semiotics. In other words, it's not a series of what does this stand for? What is being signified by this signifier? What is signified in relation to, in this instance, is always materially, graphically different. What is signified, however, is a specific type of person. Equally, it has significance for specific persons. Distance, therefore, has a twofold dimension. The sign is always doubly other. The antithesis lies in the distance, since it introduces, by definition, the realm of representation. The relationship between the signifier and the signified is always a relation of distance. Therefore, when you're interested in what is being signified, you ask of this signifier, what is its relation to something that it is not? What will identify on a metaphysical level, and thus not just visually, the mark is the closure of this space, and thus the compression of the structure of distance that representation demands. Further evidence for this distance emerges from Benjamin's description of the sign as printed on something. It can only exist, therefore, on a surface. Now, that's what he takes the sign to be. Now, the mark, he says, is fundamentally different. Don't forget, the mark is the mal, which you can hear in the word for painting. So already in distinguishing between the mark from the sign, he's using the language to identify what's particular to painting. He says the mark, on the other hand, has an emergent quality. It emerges. Benjamin goes on to argue that the mark appears on living things. There is no distinction, therefore, between its appearing and its being what it is. That's extraordinary close. There is no distinction between the mark, between its appearing and its being. And it's so, I mean, again, this whole question of appearance is so interesting, because we usually say, oh, she appears genuine, but I'm sure she's not. Or he appears to be a decent bloke, but I'm sure he's not. Where the word appearance has lodged within it the idea of falsity. It's just an appearance. You know, he's always like that. He appears that way, but really he's a bastard. You know, so what we hear in the word appearing is a structure of the false. Now Benjamin is saying, no, that which shines forth in the appearance in regard to the mark is being. And he plays on the German Schein and Erscheinen and a whole series of words linked to this. But appearing and being become the same in the realm of the mark. Now, therefore, what you can see emerging, I think, very clearly in relation to painting is a way of talking about painting in which its appearance is what it is. There is nothing other than its appearing. Now, that begins to give us a way of thinking about particularity in painting. And I'll then explain towards the end why that then becomes important for thinking about other forms, one of which will be architecture. For Benjamin, the mark is always absolute and resembles nothing else in its manifestation. And manifestation is erscheinen in German. And the word shine means appear, to have lustrousness. So it is what it is in its appearance. Examples of this mark, and you all know this one, like what is blushing? Blushing is exactly that. And blushing then becomes very interesting. For that very reason, it's an example, as it were, of this absolute mark. Examples of the mark blushing not only indicate a relation to this state of affairs, but, as I said before, another instance of it would be the emergence of the writing in Rembrandt's painting of Belshazzar. Now, that's not an example that Benjamin gives. I'm giving you that as an example. That it's the appearance of those words that are the absolute mark. There is no way of distinguishing between what appears and what is. Now, but then Benjamin will make the little theological move, which we shall note and then pass on, that what this then does is form a relationship to the divine. Because this becomes the idea of linking naming and being. He then adds, and this will serve as an introduction of painting, that the temporal simultaneity and its meaning do not delimit the medium of the mark. This is the opening to painting. What has emerged with the mark, indeed what may be said to characterize its presence, and here the characteristic in question is essentially metaphysical, is the mark's self-referential nature. The absolute mark only ever refers to itself. The self-referential has an opening out, an opening already noted in the possible confluence between sign and mark. In the case of the instances given by Benjamin, what he's interested in is the connection this has to God's naming ability. In the case of painting, there'll be a similar correspondence with the divine. In this instance, it will not be a refusal of the distinction between past and future, but the connection between the act of naming and the conferring of identity. What's always interesting in Benjamin is the way in which he uses the resources of the Hebrew Bible to think through concerns that are explicitly non-theological. In other words, in some sense, the engagement with theology is always done outside of the realm of the theological. In other words, what he wants to see in the Hebrew Bible is an engagement with the question of naming, and therefore to learn from that. His very early text on the question of language makes the same move, that he's interested in the way in which naming and being work together without then being committed to any other sorts of things. The other fundamental theological motif in Benjamin's work, and it's often commented upon, is the idea of absolute interruption, of a cessation, of what in German is called a Kaisur, or a caesura, in which something emerges unpredictably. The very famous German poet Hölderlin described his own work in terms of a caesura, an interruption in which something emerged, a counter-rhythmic thrust, as he put it, in which expectation, interruption. Not simply a counter-expectation, but what you expected simply doesn't happen, and something emerges in that interruption. Now, that thinking of the Kaisur and the centrality of interruption, Benjamin gets from what he takes to be the arrival of the Messiah, namely that at any moment, things will not continue to be the way they are. There will be that interruption. So the thinking of interruption he gets from worrying about how this operates theologically, but then takes it out of the realm of theology, blends it, that heady mixture with German Romanticism, and it becomes the thinking of modernity as interruption. So this question of his relationship to the theological is always a complex one, but what he's doing is using the resources in order to think something else. And indeed, I mean, just, it's worth noting parenthetically that is it possible to think interruption or cessation without in that very act evoking something messianic? And I mean, there's some wonderful text by Derrida on this very question. I mean, is it possible to think a messianism without the Messiah? Namely, to think interruption without that being then committed to all the theological baggage, as it were, that would then come with it. I'm not wise enough to know the answer to that question, but I'm wise enough to know that it is a question. And this is what Benjamin is doing in raiding the Hebrew Bible. It's to give him ways of thinking. So what do we humans do? And every time we acquire a pet or a child or both, one after the other, separately, what do we do with these poor beasts? We say Jimmy. And that's not simply that it's a random name, that's Jimmy forever. And indeed, when I got I'll just tell you a story. When I got a dog recently, because I called it Buster. And actually my daughter called it Buster. But everyone afterwards said, it's just the perfect name. He's so Busterish. And I thought, hello, how could a dog? But no, he is his name. You are, Bill, Frank, Mary, whatever you are. You are what you are. You are your name. We imitate God, and it's the only time we can do it by naming. And it's not simply we name something, they acquire that identity through naming. Now, Benjamin is interested in that. He's interested in the fact that we acquire identity through the act of naming. And something is in its being named. Now, if you go back to what I said in the very beginning, this is clearly what art criticism is. It's not, though it's divine. Have a look at art critics, they're hardly divine. But what it is that moment in which the object comes to be through the act of its being named as art. We imitate the divine, for Benjamin, in that very moment. Now, take this a stage further. What I'm interested in now is that naming, if you like, then becomes a form of creating. There are a number of elements of this that are important. One I've already mentioned in my opening remarks between art and criticism. Now, in regards to the first, is that art is that which is named as such within the act of criticism. And indeed, I'm quite happy to argue the very polemical position that criticism is that which constitutes the work of art as a work of art. And indeed, it's criticism that constitutes any object as what it is through that act. Because it's the only thing that names its particularity. It's the only thing that doesn't reduce it to an example of something. It's that act that says, this is art, and then explains why. Secondly, criticism necessitates that incorporation of what's called a higher power. Now, this higher power is, as you'll see, is language. Benjamin begins his treatment of painting by invoking the distinction, originally drawn in the context by Scholem in his letter, between colour and line. The setting is the opening line in which the image or painting, and again, let's be German just for a second, das Bild. It's not its image and its painting. It's neither pure painting nor pure image, it's the Bild. It's the image in that sense. Then he says that this image or painting is described as having keinen Untergrund. It has no background. So it's much like the line-surface relation in this instance. The absence of this form of ground, clearly as a literal presence, introduces what was alluded to earlier when I talked about a thickened surface. But equally, if it flips us into architecture, one of the most tiresome oppositions that architects continually use are figure-ground relations, as though the ground is the necessity for the figure, as though there's only a figure if there's a ground. And I suppose that what we've learnt from architects like Eisenman and others is that if we're thinking about urbanism, we're never thinking about figure-ground relations. We're only ever thinking about figure-figure relations. And indeed, I mean, though this is hardly the time to do it, a delicate, nuanced, and hence slightly falsifying reading of Colin Rowe's Collage City will take us halfway there. In that way, it gets rid of the notion of the ground. And what Benjamin is doing in thinking about the notion of composition in painting is getting rid of this idea that there is a relationship between a figure and a ground, an image and its Untergrund, its background. So the absence introduces what I called before a thickened surface. Even though the example given is from Raphael, Benjamin's argument that the distinction of colour within one of his works is not brought about by the use of a graphic line. This is an argument that has much greater extension. It is worth noting Benjamin's actual formulation. He writes that, and I quote, "the reciprocal demarcations of a coloured surface composition of a painting by Raphael are not based on the graphic line," end quote. To which he then adds that, in essence, compositions of this type have nothing to do with the graphic line. Now, that's interesting. Remember the very first part of the lecture, I talked about the graphic line. The line that's drawn on the white surface constitutes the surface as the surface. He's saying that's true about the way the line works, but it's not true in painting. In painting, there is no background. There is simply what is called composition. And what, as you'll see in a moment, what composition is that which allows something to be named. It becomes very interesting. So composition is the quality that has the right to be named. So painting is not for him a series of drawing lines on a background that then become more detailed. It's a series of internal relations. And that's going to be true. And if you want the Raphael moment, just go down the road, go into the Raphael room, you know, the girl with the wheel, have a look at St. Catherine's wonderful clothes, the thickness of the clothes, and you'll see that in no way could you see anything other than an internally regulated system to do with the composition of folds and colours. There is no line there in this very strict sense that the application of the line is that which constitutes a background. And it's up at the moment, it's worth going to see. The significance of the formulation lies in the first instance in the identification of the coloured surface with composition. And composition, if you want the little art historical moment, is one of these terms that is, from Winkelmann onwards, is fundamental to the discussion of painting. But what iconology does is turn composition into the creation of symbols that are then identified as outside. So the meaning through iconology is always external. Composition for Benjamin has to do with internal relations. In the second place, however, yields a further instance in which the focus of the concern becomes the surface. Prior to taking up the above-mentioned identification between coloured surface and composition, it is essential to note the refrain of the surface. The 2 points that have been noted are the following. In the first instance, it is that the graphic line attains identity by the way it contrasts to a surface or area. The reciprocity between surface and line in drawing is fundamental, since the surface is now no longer a simple background. Equally, of course, the graphic line holds itself apart from a simple surface. It forms its own surface in marking it out. In sum, therefore, the surface, in this regard, and in the other regard as well, is a construct of art's work. The second point stems from the argument already cited, in which Benjamin differentiates between them. The identity the background of a drawing has, and its inscription on a white surface. Both of these terms are, to use Benjamin's formulation, metaphysical. They are beyond the hold of the eye. In addition, they are preparatory to any definition of painting. They clear the way, however, by allowing the concepts proper to painting to emerge. And I think that, again, this would be an interesting point, is that whether one's talking about architecture or whether one's talking about painting or drawing, what we can argue is that the way in which the struggle to describe what they are, the struggle to engage with what they are takes place, that then becomes generative of the terminology and the modes of thinking proper to them. In other words, their particularity is given with them. Now, we could think of particularity in terms of ideal essences. We don't. We think of particularity as much to do with what the construction is, or the composition is, to the way the composition has been constructed. In other words, the latter allows us to think about the technical and therefore the notion of technique. The former allows us to think about the internal nature of the object. But what Benjamin is suggesting, or what I'm reading him is suggesting, is that the very activity of drawing and marking and then of painting, what is emerging are the concepts in which we understand them. What has opened up here is a concern, as I've said, with the surface that is beyond any reduction to the literal surface. And once that point is conceded, once we can put to one side the notion of the literal, then not only is that important because things are rarely reducible to their literal presence, if we can get rid of the concept of the literal, then we can ask the question, all right, then what is it? If it's not literally a surface, what is it? If it's not literally this, what is it? And it's this distancing of the literal that allows, if you almost like, the truth of objects to emerge. And that's Flaubert's point. And what he's saying to Louise Collet is that it's only by pausing, it's only by saying that objects are not literally what they are, it's only by avoiding the trap of empiricism that you can be a realist. In other words, you can deal with objects really by allowing them to be really what they are, which is always in excess of their description. And if there's something that art knows, is that if you go and look at the Raphael, St. Catherine's clothes are always in excess of any description you could give them. That excess is fundamental. It's not an added part, it's actually real. The opposite is the literal. So it's not that the opposite of the literal is the figural. The opposite of the literal is the real, where the real has to be understood in Flaubert's sense of that which has esprit, that extra animate quality that's proper to objects. So we move beyond the literal. Now, in relation to painting, if you think about the Raphael, now there is the coloured surface, which is what? Which is composition. What is for Benjamin, I quote him, astonishing about this state of affairs is that a composition cannot be equated with the graphic. And just again, go to any museum look at a painting, it could never be equated with its assemblage, with that which makes it up, with the graphic. Moreover, a composition, remembering of course the reciprocity, if not identity, between composition and a coloured surface, is not an illusion. What appears is not an illusion, and the Germans in the audience will appreciate that. In other words, it is neither semblance nor mere appearance. What then is it that appears? What is the Bild? What is the image if it's not reducible to mere appearance? The image is more than marks. The proof of this proposition resides for Benjamin in the negative supposition, and this is crucial. Namely, if it were only marks, then the composition would be impossible to name. In other words, and take it in the dumbest way possible, if it weren't art, it couldn't be named as art. And that may sound ridiculous, but one of the great interesting moments is that we don't know what counts as art, but the responsible critic says of the Mutt Pissoir, it's art, and then we debate it. In other words, the pissoir is art through being named as such, and if the argument works, it is named successfully as such. And so his point is that the composition would be it would be impossible to name something as art if it, as it were, weren't art. But the act of naming it as such constitutes it as such. Now, we can debate this. I could claim to you that this is a work of art, but you may say, look, no matter how you describe it, there's something about its composition that doesn't allow it to be named as art. And we can debate that backwards and forwards. But in the end, the claim is not to do with anything essential, or there being something that it's proper, or anything like that, or even that it can be put into a museum. What allows it to be art is the possibility of its being named as such. So the name, which is always external to the art object, constitutes the art object. Hence the centrality of the question of prose. That's why prose is, I mean, this word we never use, prose is fundamental to our thinking, because it's that constitutive moment where something becomes what it is. So, as he says, something has to be a composition, otherwise it would be impossible to name. 2 points, therefore. The first is that a picture can be described such that it is no more than marks. And yet, secondly, there is something else. The picture, the Bild, the image, is linked to something that it is not. And for Benjamin, it's fundamental to recognise that the image, the Bild, is always linked to something it is not. And we have to take this expression, it is not, or itself isn't, in the strongest way possible. That this is the verb to be. This is refers to the ontology, the mode of being proper to art objects. The mode of being proper to art objects is that they refer to something, etwas, something that they are not. And this something, this etwas, as you'll see, is language, is prose. What this something is not mere prose, is prose used as naming. Benjamin writes in the early text. In his later text, he'll say it's prose used as criticism. Therefore, following Hölderlin, art objects have, by definition, a prosaic quality. They can be named as art objects, or whatever they are. This other element is language. The composition, the coloured surface, transcends any reduction to marks. It overcomes the marks themselves, overcoming by incorporating them. And I won't have time to do this tonight, but it's in terms of this overcoming of the reduction of composition to marks that I think, for what it's worth, allows one to draw a distinction between a notion of technique and the technical. In other words, the technical is the in certain modes of painting you put a white background on and then you apply colour over white, you thicken the white or thin the white in certain areas, therefore the paint you put on has a different appearance depending on the background, etc., etc. These are technical things, and they're very important if you go to art school. You don't just paint, you need to understand this. It's what you learn when you learn a computer program, if you're learning how to draw, if you're doing architecture, you acquire technical skills. These are not techniques, they're technical skills. That's why the work cannot be reduced to the technical, but we can begin to understand as the operation of techniques. One of the examples I always use, and so if you've heard me before, you'll know this example, as a crude generalization, you can say that early Cézanne draws a line and puts colour on either side of it. Late Cézanne creates a line by juxtaposing colour. That's technique. It's not the technical. In other words, there are two fundamentally different conceptions of the line that operate under this heading Cézanne, and they're radically different notions of line. Again, go to the Cézanne room downtown and you'll see exactly how that works. There's two Cézannes from early, late period. You'll see there are fundamentally different conceptions of the line. That's what technique is. But it's not the technical. The technical is how you actually get the paint to work that way. The technique is the creation of the line. I do recognise this is a complex, and like all distinctions, slightly difficult to maintain at every moment. Nonetheless, I would so want to do. So Benjamin's argument is that in what you do in the act of criticism is engage with composition. And what you do in engaging with composition is deal with techniques. And that's why if we need to understand art objects and indeed architectural objects, as I'll argue in my very last lecture, what you need is an ontology of techniques. You need to begin to think seriously about the techniques proper to art as opposed to architecture, as opposed to whatever. And it's only by thinking through techniques that we can begin to give specificity to the activity we call criticism. Composition creates, as I've been trying to argue, the possibility of naming. What is introduced, Benjamin says, is a higher power. Prior to taking up the question of how this power is to be understood, the nature of its presence needs to be noted. The power is neutral. Placed within the mark, it resides there without threatening the mark. While not the same, it inhabits the mark because it is related to it. After presenting these moves which work to situate this power, he then defines it, and I quote, "This power that's there in the mark but can't be seen, it's like the surging white waves. The power is the linguistic word which lodges in the medium of the language of painting, invisible as such, and revealing itself only in the composition." Then he says, the picture, das Bild, the picture, is named after the composition. In other words, when he says the picture or the image is named after the composition, what he means is that the composition comes to be through that act of naming. In other words, it comes to be what it is through that act. End quote. The marks and the overall composition bear the name. There is a sense in which, as I've been trying to indicate, that the painting comes to be what it is through naming. And yet it is not as though, and I think this is the key critical point, it is not as though any work can be named. The act of naming, that's why we're not God. The act of naming will, and nor are critics, God forbid. That's why the act of naming becomes the site of contestation. Precisely because there is no absolute name, hence it's only ever a reference to the divine, there's no absolute name, there is nonetheless that naming which becomes a site of contestation. Namely, I can debate with you about whether that's art. I name it as such, but then we can argue it. And if you think about it, I think this is a fundamental point, that the politics of art, because everyone wants art to be political, has nothing to do with its content at all. That's just modern iconology that reads offensive images in art. We don't want that. Like Panofsky's children see art as sexist or whatever, or racist because of its content. That's not the politics of art, though that may be true. The politics of art is that it has to maintain a site in which contestation takes place. In other words, art is inherently democratic because it demands a public sphere in which there is a debate about whether something's art. So when criticism names art as art, that's terrorism or the absolute state unless someone else can come along and say, no, it's not. And that debate can take place. Both of these people in this debate know that art is what it is through the act of naming, but one of them saying, no, I disagree with you. Or, yes, but for different reasons. In other words, because we live in a secular world and there is no absolute naming, then the very act of naming will always be, by definition, contestable. And because This is not simply a private activity. It's in the public realm. It therefore demands the public realm. So the politics of art is there, inherent in the nature of criticism. But it's more than that. It's inherent in the ontology of the art object as that which comes into being by being named, but because we're not God, it can never be named absolutely. Now, hence what we need to understand in regards to painting, that there is this thing called composition. This then allows for an understanding of the history of painting that is no longer bound by iconography, but by the relationship between the mark and word. In other words, we can begin to rethink the history of art, not in terms of its contextualism, but of the way in which at a certain moment a work is named. How in a certain period is something named as art? He goes on in talking about this relationship between mark and composition. He says, mark and composition, I quote, are the elements of every picture, every build, every image, that claims the right to be named. It's as though what the work of art does is make a demand on you. It says, name me as art. Now, you can't just simply say that it's art. You have to say how it is art. That's what the naming is. That's why naming is criticism. Now, the eras of painting, the history of painting there, has to do with the way composition and medium occur. That is, with what word is there, how it is named as art. And what's interesting then is that, and I think this is a point that's well worth making, that we can make these arguments now for one reason and one reason only, is that art emerges as a category with the demise of religion. When I go into a museum and look at a woman doing this, and I want someone else doing this, and little things happening, it's called Annunciation, and I'm sure you don't, you have no idea what you're looking at. Absolutely none. Then you can read a book about the Annunciation, you think, oops, that's interesting, I know that. But you don't know. 200-300 years ago, you knew. And if you didn't know, there was going to be a problem for you. So you knew, and that's not art. That's theology, that's religion. Art emerges precisely at that moment when you don't know what you're looking at. And at that point, you then discuss it and name it as art. But it's that separation that's marked by the not knowing brings back the point I made in the very beginning. It brings back what characterizes art, and that is mediacy. The understanding of it is not immediate, because I don't know. It's mediated, and once I don't know, then all things can be art. Therefore, I can begin to argue about what makes art art, precisely because of this space that's opened up by the not knowing. Art emerges with modernity as a concept, as a practice, precisely through this notion of the mediate. Then we retrospectively constitute a history of art. By definition, we go back and say, well, that was art, and that was art. But half of it were altars in churches, torn off, whacked in a museum. You have no idea what's going on, but you used to. So art emerges at that and can have a history precisely because of immediacy. Now, that's more or less where I wanted to go with the Benjamin text. Just in passing, I'll try and indicate why I think this sort of argument is fundamental. When he writes about the relationship between the line and the surface, what it allows us to recognize that with the drawn line on a surface, the identity of one is constituted by the other. There isn't an external world in which you then draw a line. That the identity is constituted by that relation. When you move to painting, something in addition happens. What happens in addition is that the relationship between mark and composition makes a demand on you. It says, name me. Give me a name. And that when you do that, you're indulging in art criticism. So it's got to be the right name, though we will then debate what the right name is. Now, what we then have to recognize is that what painting brings with it is that which is proper to painting. Namely, for Benjamin, he uses the language of mark and composition, though we can use others. Mark and composition are not reducible to literally the brush strokes that are there. Hence, there'll always be a disjunctive relationship between the assemblage and its operative quality. That operative quality is the range of techniques and the operation of techniques. Now, therefore, if we're interested in the relationship between art and painting, we're not interested in the content of painting, and it may be having a picture of a building in it or something like this. That would be terribly uninteresting. What is actually interesting is, given that there is a concept of technique which is fundamental to painting that makes a painting what it is, that's the assumption, how does it work in the realm of architecture? Namely, that if there are the concepts and categories proper to the activity of architecture, then they emerge from the practice of architecture. But that practice cannot have an essential quality. That practice isn't unified or unique. That practice, as it were, has a history. The very first lecture I gave, I tried to argue by looking at the concept of the archive, that what happens is, precisely because architecture is bound up necessarily with its capacity to represent its own activity, that precisely because the nature of how it represents itself changes, and that's internal to its operation, that's part of what makes architecture, or gives architecture, its specific autonomy, that our then project is to actually, or the project of architectural theory, is to theorize that activity. In other words, to theorize the activity of architecture's capacity to represent itself in what it does. Precisely the same, therefore, to use the Benjaminian language, the building, if it's a building, and we always have to have this wonderful moment, we say, a building, comma, if it's a building, comma, or architecture, comma, were it to be architecture, makes a demand, and it has the right so to do. The right is not to say, oh, it's just a building. We do that. Distraction does work. We know that. But the critic is, or the theorist, is concerned with something very specific, namely, how is it as architecture? That will work as much for an argument about a building that's a fait accompli that's up, as it will to a digital model, or as it will to a representation or a drawing or whatever. What we take to each of these is the question, how is this architecture? It makes a claim on us to be architecture, or two critics could argue about whether it is. But either way, once the claim or the right to be named as architecture is on the table, once that's at stake, then it's incumbent upon us to address its specificity. And that's why one needs to continually develop a vocabulary, a language, a conceptual apparatus in which to understand the architectural, or painting, or sculpture, or whatever it is. In other words, we never move between these two. The very fact, and I'll finish at this point, that we can say that there is a technique proper to painting, and that painting has its own particularity. It's only by allowing that we can then posit a relationship to something else called architecture. It's only by saying there's something specific to architecture that we would never reduce it to sculpture. And in our refusal to reduce it to sculpture, we will then be able to see it had a relation to sculpture. In other words, it's only by allowing for particularity that relationality comes through. Okay, that's where I wanted to go today. That's enough. It's late. I'm hungry. Tuesday, at what time I don't remember, it's either 5 or 7, 5 o'clock, I want to talk about Malevich and the question of abstraction and the nature of the abstract line. Thank you very much.